No one group of people in history suffered as much oppression for so long as women did. In every country in the world, and in almost every civilization, women were given secondary status to men, and forced to either accept it or to rebel and be condemned by society. Only a century ago in America, women had no rights at all. They couldn't vote, chiefly because men believed they weren't educated and informed enough. Yet higher education was denied them. Only one college in the United States allowed women admittance. There were no women doctors or lawyers, and of course no women legislators. Married women literally belonged to their spouses. If they earned money, either through work or inheritance, that money was legally their husband's and not their own. Women who did work were often paid half of what men were paid for the same job. Besides the legal restrictions on women were the social restrictions. Much of what men were allowed to do was considered inappropriate for women. Single women weren't even expected to go out without a male guardian by their side. The way women talked, dressed, behaved, and even the way they thought was all strictly regulated by the standards deeply embedded in the society. With the exception of ancient Egypt and Rome, this deprivation of legal and social rights had been the fate of women since the beginning of time. But in the 19th century, all that began to change. By the 1800s, the question of women's voting rights finally became an issue, and the struggle was particularly intense in Great Britain and America. In the mid-1800s, women in Great Britain and America began a movement for women's equality that eventually swept most of the globe. For the first time, they organized, defined their goals, and launched a campaign for public and political support. In 1848, women in the United States released their first written set of demands. It included a woman's right to, in their words, have personal freedom, to acquire an education, to earn a living, to claim her wages, to own property, to make contracts, to bring suit, to testify in court, to obtain a divorce for just cause, to possess her children, and to claim a fair share of the accumulations during marriage. There was not even the mention of a right to vote, but that would soon follow. It would follow largely because of the work of a spirited and tireless woman named Susan B. Anthony. Susan Brownell Anthony was born February 15, 1820, in Adams, Massachusetts. Her father was a Quaker, and although he was flexible about his religion, Susan grew up dressing in the austere clothing of Quakers and speaking in the traditional thee and thou. Her mother, Lucy Reed, was a Baptist, but she adopted most of the Quaker customs when she married Daniel Anthony. Both parents believed in the equality of men and women. Daniel Anthony was an intelligent, intellectual man with liberal beliefs, some from the Quaker community, some all his own. He ran a mill that was sometimes prosperous, sometimes not, but always required his full time and attention. As a result, Lucy Reed ran the household and farm by herself. A demanding job, since she had 8 children, plus the mill hands that frequently boarded in the Anthony home. The children learned responsibility early, sharing in the chores and sometimes helping their father at the mill. Since Susan was the second oldest, many of the tasks fell to her. Daniel and Lucy Anthony believed strongly in educating their children, boys and girls alike. Susan was precocious and could read and write by the time she was only 3 years old. In their early years, the children were taught by a governess at home, but as Susan progressed, she was sent to an elementary school. She marched off full of hope and eager to learn more. The hope soon turned to despair. The first thing she noticed at school was that the boys were given more attention than the girls. They were called on to answer questions and recite more often, and were given special privileges and bonuses. But worst of all, they were allowed to study arithmetic, and girls were not. Susan loved arithmetic. She was full of envy when the boys went into a corner with the teacher to review their math lessons, and she and the girls were left behind to continue their reading and writing. When she summoned the courage to ask her teacher if she too could take math, she was told that girls didn't need it. When she entered her teens, the Anthonys sent Susan to a girls' boarding school near Philadelphia, with the intimidating name of Miss Molson Select Seminary for Females. Once again, she found the curriculum focused less on intellectual development and more on conformity in behavior. But before she could rebel, she was called home after only 6 months on a family emergency. In 1838, when Susan was 18, the United States was hit by the worst financial crash in its history, and thousands of people went bankrupt. Among them was Susan's father, who was forced to move to a town in New York aptly called Hardscrabble. He owned land there and hoped to make a living as a farmer, although that plan later failed, and he took work at a life insurance company. Susan was recruited as assistant manager of the farm, work that proved rewarding because it gave her the opportunity to meet and talk with some of her father's guests, many of whom were active in social reform. It was in these penny-pinching days on the farm that she gained a different kind of wealth: information, knowledge, and the awareness that there were serious social injustices in America, and there were people who were working to correct them. She was exposed to the ideas of many of the leading reformers of her time, including Frederick Douglass, who was a frequent visitor to the Anthony home. Anthony once remembered, Mr. Douglass always brought along his violin. He liked to play it and sing, and we were happy listening to him. Between the singing and the playing, however, was a lot of talk about slavery, abolition, and politics. At the time, Douglass was publishing a newspaper that demanded immediate freedom for the millions of slaves throughout the South. Northern businessmen resented him, fearing he would threaten their lucrative trade with the South, and he had endured much ridicule and harassment. Anthony admired his cause and his fighting spirit. In the time she spent on her father's farm, she decided that she, too, would become an activist for social change. As the Depression continued and her father's farm failed, Susan set about trying to figure out how to give financial help to her parents. There are 2 events that can occur in a society which, although unfortunate, often have the beneficial effects of giving women greater independence and opportunity. One of them is war, and the other is a depression. In this depression of the early 1800s, many women like Susan began to think for the first time of finding a way to make a living and support themselves. Susan chose a safe profession for women: teaching. Her first job was as an assistant principal of a boarding school in New Rochelle, for which she received a salary of $30 for 15 weeks of work. When her term was over, she took a post as a teacher in a country school, taking the place of a man who was paid $10 a week. She was given $2.50. More teaching positions followed until Susan worked her way up to principal of the girls' department in the Kanajahari Academy. She was now a young woman, tall, with broad shoulders, inquisitive, and energetic. During these years, out on her own with freedom and spending money she'd never had before, Susan began to break away from her Quaker upbringing. She took an avid interest in politics, committing herself first to the cause of abolition and freeing the slaves, and then to temperance, the campaign to abolish alcoholic beverages. Although temperance seemed like a rather puritanical cause today, in the 1800s, heavy drinking was a serious social problem, with repercussions in the family and the workforce. While she campaigned for these 2 causes, Anthony also had her mind on the many inequities she'd seen in the employment of women, both in her teaching profession and at her father's mill. As yet, she was unsure what to do about the problems or how to approach a solution. There were other women, however, who were about to find a way. In 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott held the now famous Seneca Falls Convention, nicknamed the Hen Convention by male critics. It was the first organized attempt to bring women together to discuss their oppression and come up with a proposal for action. The goal of the meeting was to focus on social, civil, and religious freedom for women. Anthony heard about the convention from her family, which always kept informed about reform movements, and decided she would attend. While taking a walk in Seneca Falls with a friend, she was introduced to Elizabeth Stanton. It was the beginning of a friendship and working partnership that would last over 50 years. At first, however, Anthony wasn't interested in joining the women's movement and decided instead to put her energy into the temperance fight. She joined the Daughters of Temperance, a local organization, then battled her way up to the state level. Abandoning her teaching job, she founded and devoted herself full-time to the Women's State Temperance Society of New York. Anthony had no particular speaking abilities, but over the years she trained herself to become a forceful, dynamic orator. She also learned to be a persuasive writer, but her greatest assets were her organizing abilities and her phenomenal energy, which never diminished in over 60 years of political campaigning. It was her work in the Temperance Society that finally led Anthony to the women's movement, not because of any affinity between the two groups, but because of her troubles with the men in temperance work. There, just as she'd found in schools, the men called all the shots. They wouldn't allow the women to work side by side with them, refused to let them do any public speaking,